Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Christmas morning at my parents' house was always the same story told over and over, wrapped in shiny paper and cheap perfume, like we were all actors stuck inside a bad holiday movie we couldn't quit filming. The smell of burnt cinnamon rolls hung in the air like a heavy curtain, mixing with the sharp tang of pine from the fake tree my mother refused to replace even though half the branches drooped like they were mourning. It was the kind of setting that people post about online, calling it cozy or charming, but if you scratched the surface even a little, you would find years of resentment polished to a fake shine. I sat on the scratchy beige couch, balancing a lukewarm cup of coffee on my knee, smiling so wide I thought my damn cheeks might crack right open. Derek lounged across from me, wearing that stupid flannel shirt he thought made him look rugged, like he had ever done a hard day's work in his life. My parents bustled around him like he was some returning war hero and not a 39-year-old man who still needed help filing his taxes. When my father cleared his throat and reached under the tree, I already knew what was coming because some betrayals you can smell before they even happen. He pulled out a small velvet box, not the kind you put jewelry in. No, the kind that holds something heavier, more permanent, more final. He held it out to Derek with a grin that pulled tight at the corners of his mouth, the way his face always did when he thought he was doing something magnanimous, but was really just covering up a decision he had already made months ago. "Your mother and I," he said, pausing like he was about to announce something that would be carved into the history books, "we decided it's time to pass down the family cabin." Derek leaned forward, all fake humility and real greed. "Wow, Dad. I don't know what to say." "Say thank you, Derek. Say screw you to your sister who spent every summer hammering nails into that porch and painting those sagging shutters right alongside you while our parents sat drinking beer on the deck," I thought, but instead I smiled and took a slow sip of my coffee. It tasted bitter, and for once, it wasn't just the cheap supermarket brand they always bought on sale. "We think you'll take good care of it," Mom chimed in, her voice high and chirpy like she was selling Avon products door to door again. "You know, keep it in the family." Keep it in the family, but not for both of us, apparently. Just for the golden boy. The one who could do no wrong even when he wrecked Dad's truck at 17, even when he flunked out of college and blamed it on bad professors, even when he borrowed money and conveniently forgot to pay it back. Meanwhile, I had gone to work straight after high school, helped cover bills when Dad got laid off, but somehow none of that ever counted. I watched as Derek opened the box and found a gleaming new set of keys lying inside, tucked into dark velvet like a crown jewel. His face lit up like he had won the lottery, and in a way, he had, just not the way he thought. My heart thudded dully against my ribs, not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. Not one damn bit. "You okay, Hannah?" my mom asked, tilting her head like she was already half bored with pretending to care about my feelings. "Of course," I said, layering sugar over my voice like frosting on a burnt cake. "I'm so happy for you, Derek." "Really?" He gave me that smirk, the one that said he knew exactly how much it hurt, and that was the whole point. I wanted to throw my coffee in his lap, watch him jump and yelp like a kicked dog, but instead, I just smiled wider. Because they thought they had one. They thought this morning was the end of the story, the final scene where the favored son rode off into the snowy sunset with the family treasure tucked safely under his arm, while the dutiful daughter clapped and cheered from the sidelines. But see, they had forgotten something important. There was still one present under the tree they hadn't opened yet. A small, flat envelope tucked way in the back, wrapped in cheap red paper and tied with a crooked little bow. The real gift. The one that was going to wipe the smug look right off Derek's face and turn my parents' laughter into stunned silence. I leaned back on the couch, sipped my coffee again, and waited. Christmas morning wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The thing about betrayal, especially the kind that comes with a smile and a slice of pie, is that it never really shows up all at once like a punch in the face. It leaks in slow, tiny cracks until one day you are standing knee-deep in it, wondering how the hell you let it get this far. I knew. Deep in my gut weeks before Christmas that something was going on behind my back, the same way you know when milk has gone bad without even opening the carton. There is just something sour about the air that you cannot unsmell. It started with the whispering phone calls my mother would take in the laundry room, her voice dropping low and sharp like she was trying to cut the words before they could reach me. Then there were the long, uncomfortable pauses when I walked into a room, the way my father would quickly change the subject to something stupid like the weather or the goddamn football scores. Even though nobody in this family had given a damn about football since Derek sprained his ankle in 8th grade and declared himself too fragile for sports. I wasn't born yesterday, and while my parents like to think of me as the good kid, the quiet one, what they forgot is that quiet doesn't mean stupid. It just means you have learned to listen better than anyone else. So 3 weeks before Christmas, while everyone else was scrambling through malls and fighting over discount televisions, I was busy cooking up my own little holiday surprise. I spent hours in that crummy little law library downtown, the one that still smells like mildew and floor wax, combing through property records and tax filings until my head hurt and my fingers were stained with ink. It was there, between the brittle pages of some forgotten zoning ordinance, that I found my golden ticket, my get-out-of-screwed-free card, the loophole that was so obvious it was almost funny. Turns out, about 35 years ago, when my grandparents transferred ownership of the cabin to my parents, they never properly registered the land underneath it, just the structure itself. Some bureaucratic mess-up, a missing form here, an unpaid tax there, and suddenly the land was a separate entity altogether, floating around like a ghost nobody had bothered to notice. Legally speaking, the cabin and the dirt it sat on were two different beasts entirely. And if someone were to, say, quietly purchase the rights to that forgotten patch of land, well, they would technically own the ground, and anything resting on it would be subject to their say-so. It took a lot of digging, a lot of greasy palms, and honestly, it had taken me nearly $2,055 to pull this off, which, I later realized, was not quite right because $2,055 is not even close to the number I ended up spending, but by then I was in too deep to back out. I visited offices so small and dusty that even the clerks looked like they might crumble into dust if you poked them too hard. I filled out forms in triplicate, nodded politely while some old man explained easement rights in a voice so slow I thought I might actually fall asleep standing up, and I wrote checks so fast my hand cramped. Every signature felt like carving a notch into the barrel of a gun that I would point right at Christmas morning. Finally, with everything tucked neatly into a folder, I sat down at my kitchen table one late night, the wind howling against the windows like some angry thing, and wrote the letter. It was simple, really, just a straightforward notification of ownership transfer, a copy of the land deed with my name stamped big and bold across the top, and a little note explaining the situation in language even Derek could not possibly pretend to misunderstand. "Merry Christmas, assholes," I thought as I folded the documents into a plain white envelope and sealed it tight. At the last minute, I bought some cheap red wrapping paper and a roll of curling ribbon that refused to curl no matter how many times I scraped it with the edge of my scissors. I didn't care. It wasn't about appearances anymore. It was about facts. It was about making sure they understood that you cannot lie to someone for 40 years and expect them to keep playing nice forever. On Christmas Eve, while my parents were upstairs arguing about whether Derek should bring his new girlfriend over, I slipped the envelope under the tree. It nestled right between the big, flashy gifts, the ones wrapped in metallic gold paper and huge bows, looking small and pathetic and completely unimportant, just another afterthought from the daughter who never caused a fuss. Nobody noticed. Not a glance. Not a raised eyebrow. Perfect. Now, sitting on that ugly beige couch, feeling the weight of the morning settle heavy in my chest, I watched as my father stretched and yawned theatrically, patting his pockets like he was searching for the last of the excitement. "Well," he said, his voice smug and full of finality, "I guess that's everything, huh?" I sipped my coffee and let the moment hang there, just a little too long, the way a good joke needs just the right pause before the punchline. Then, feigning a little confusion, I leaned forward and pointed lazily under the tree. Actually, I said, drawing the word out like a piece of candy you don't want to finish, there's still one more left. That little red one in the back. Mom bent down with a groan, fishing out the forgotten envelope like it was a piece of trash that had blown in from outside. She turned it over in her hands, frowning, and then passed it to Dad, who ripped open the paper with the eagerness of a man who already assumed whatever was inside was going to be about Derek. He unfolded the letter. He read it once. Then he read it again, slower this time, like the words were trying to wriggle off the page and escape. The room, which had been so full of fake cheer a moment ago, dropped into a heavy, stunned silence so thick you could have sliced it with a butter knife. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the end table and folded my hands neatly in my lap. Showtime. The moment my father's eyes traced the last line of the letter, it was as if the floor dropped out from under Christmas morning, leaving the four of us suspended in an ugly, choking kind of silence that felt almost physical. My mother leaned in, peering over my father's shoulder with her mouth slightly open, like a kid seeing something broken that they could not fix with Scotch tape and blind optimism. Derek, oblivious at first, kept twirling the keys around his index finger, grinning like he had just been crowned king of the universe, until he caught the look on Dad's face and let the keys fall into his lap with a dull metallic clink that seemed to echo too loud against the walls of the living room. It took another full minute, a long, dragging, awful minute before my father finally found his voice, but when he did, it came out low and dangerous, the way it had when I was a kid and had gotten caught sneaking a cigarette behind the shed. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" he growled, waving the papers like they were some kind of dirty laundry he had been forced to touch against his will. His hand was shaking slightly, and I would have been lying if I said it did not make me feel something close to satisfaction, though I buried it deep under a layer of polite concern. "It means exactly what it says, Dad," I said, my tone light, almost breezy, as if we were discussing a pie recipe and not the legal ownership of the very ground their precious cabin stood on. "I bought the land, filed all the paperwork, paid the back taxes you forgot about. It's mine now." I leaned back against the couch, crossing one leg over the other and resting my arms along the back like a queen surveying a conquered kingdom. "Merry Christmas." The words seemed to hang in the air like a bad smell. Derek snatched the papers from Dad and scanned them with the desperation of a drowning man looking for a rope, his lips moving silently as he tried to process the legal jargon that, frankly, was not that complicated if you had even a grain of common sense. "You can't do this," he said finally, voice rising, the same whiny tone he used when we were kids and he got caught cheating at Monopoly. "I can," I said, shrugging one shoulder lazily, and I did. Mom pressed her hands to her mouth like she was trying to hold back a scream or maybe a sob, and when she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken in a way that made a tiny, guilty part of me flinch even though I shoved that feeling down just as fast. "But the cabin belongs to the family," she whispered, as if saying it out loud might somehow make it true, might erase the reality spelled out in cold, hard black ink. "The cabin does," I agreed, nodding pleasantly. "The building itself, sure. But the land underneath it? The foundation it sits on? The trees surrounding it? The driveway you park your car on? All mine now." I smiled, wide and bright, feeling the bitter irony settle over the room like falling ash. "You should have paid those taxes, Mom. 35 years is a long time to assume the government just forgot about you." Dad's face turned a dangerous shade of red, the same shade it had turned when the neighbor once backed into his mailbox and he threatened to sue, even though the neighbor had immediately apologized and offered to replace it. "You think this little stunt makes you better than us?" he snapped, voice trembling with rage that had been building up for decades in cracks and splinters he refused to acknowledge. "You think this is going to make up for every damn time you felt left out or second best?" I tilted my head and considered the question for a moment, savoring the way their world was crumbling so slowly, so satisfyingly, like watching a sandcastle dissolve under a rising tide. "No," I said finally. "Nothing can make up for that. But this? This feels pretty damn close." Derek shot up from the couch, his face twisted in something between rage and disbelief. "I'll fight this," he said, jabbing a finger at me like I was a mutinous crew member he was about to toss overboard. "I'll get a lawyer. I'll sue you into the ground." "You're welcome to try," I said sweetly, standing up and smoothing down my sweater. "But here's the thing, little brother, you'd have to build a pretty convincing case. And given that everything I did is 100% legal, well, good luck with that." He opened his mouth like he was going to spit out some half-baked threat, but no words came out. Instead, he just stood there, clutching the useless keys like a man holding the wrong end of a gun. Mom started crying then, soft hiccuping sobs that made me think of the time I broke her favorite vase by accident and watched her kneel in the glass shards, trying to piece it back together with trembling fingers. I felt a flicker of guilt again, sharp and sour under my ribs, but I ignored it, just like they had ignored me all these years when Derek got the bigger slice of cake, the better presents, the louder applause. This was not about money or property anymore. It was about the simple, brutal fact that for once in their perfect, scripted little lives, they could not control the ending of the story. Ron's hands tightened into fists at his sides, and for a second, I thought he might actually lunge at me, but the old man still had just enough sense left to realize that would only make things worse. Instead, he shoved the letter back into its crumpled envelope and dropped it onto the coffee table like it was something foul he did not want to touch again. "You think you've won," he said, voice low and cold. I just smiled, slow and sweet, the way a cat smiles before it bats a dying mouse across the floor. "No," I said, reaching for my coat. "I think you've finally lost." And with that, I walked toward the door, leaving them in the wreckage they had built, brick by cruel brick, all by themselves. If you had told me even a year ago that I would be the kind of person who spent weekends knee-deep in mildew-smelling archives and arguing with surly clerks about outdated tax records, I would have laughed and told you that revenge was a young person's game. Something better left to daytime TV dramas and bitter old neighbors fighting over property lines. But here I was, 3 weeks before Christmas, sitting in the back of the county courthouse with my laptop open, 2 stale vending machine coffees sweating beside me, and a crick in my neck from bending over yellowed files for too many hours at a stretch. It started small, the way most bad ideas do, a little seed of resentment planted deep enough that you forget it is even there until one day you feel the roots choking everything you thought was decent and kind in you. That seed took root sometime between my father's third casual mention of how Derek would really be the right one to handle the family cabin and my mother's chirpy reminders that boys need a little more support these days. You know how it is. Like hell I did. I knew exactly what it was, the same old dance we had been doing since Derek came screaming into this world 2 years after me, snatching attention and affection like they were toys he never had to earn. I spent hours poring over every scrap of paper related to that cabin, reading through old deeds written in loopy, faded handwriting, marveling at how many stupid little bureaucratic mistakes had piled up like dust in a forgotten attic. Every tax missed by a week, every filing fee accidentally skipped when my parents assumed no one would notice, all of it sat there like a time bomb waiting for someone stubborn enough or pissed off enough to light the fuse. By the second weekend, my back ached from the cheap metal chairs and my patience had worn down to the quick, but I pushed through because somewhere along the line, this had stopped being about property and started being about principle. My whole life, I had been taught to stay quiet, stay polite, be the one who let things go because that was what good daughters did. And for a long time, I played along, clapping for Derek's half-assed victories and pretending not to notice when the rules were different for me. But sitting there under those flickering fluorescent lights, hunched over dusty tax records and thinking about every birthday Derek had gotten a new bike, while I got a stack of second-hand books, something inside me cracked in a way I knew could never be undone. I hired a lawyer so slick he made a weasel look trustworthy, a man who specialized in creative interpretations of local property laws. He wore cheap suits and had a permanent coffee stain on his tie, but he knew the system better than anyone I had ever met. For the low cost of $2,055, and yes, I know now that I somehow managed to miscalculate that in my head because lawyers do not work that cheap, not even the greasy ones. He helped me file all the right claims, notify all the right agencies, and slide my name quietly onto the title of the land. It was not just a matter of stealing something back. It was about beating them at their own game, about using the same slippery little tricks they would have used without a second thought if the roles had been reversed. And God help me, the longer I worked on it, the sweeter it tasted, like the first sip of peppermint coffee on a cold morning when you are tired of swallowing plain bitterness. Still, there were nights I would sit up in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning its slow, lazy circles, wondering if I had crossed some invisible line between justice and cruelty. I would hear my mother's voice in my head, that syrupy, scolding tone she used when I pushed back even slightly, saying, "Hannah, you're better than that." And maybe once upon a time I had been. Maybe before 30 years of quiet betrayals and smaller sacrifices taught me that being better only meant you got less. By the time Christmas morning rolled around, I was ready. I had wrapped the envelope with hands that barely shook, taped the bow on with the same neat precision I had once used to tie my shoes before church, back when I still believed that if you played by the rules, you got rewarded in the end. The absurd thing was, they still thought they had outsmarted me right up until the moment Dad's face drained of color and Mom's mouth started trembling like a cheap porch swing in a storm. When Derek stood up, his chair scraping harsh against the wood floor, his face contorted with rage, so pure it was almost comic, I felt the tiniest, meanest thrill of satisfaction bloom in my chest like a rotten flower finally in full, glorious bloom. "This isn't over," Derek shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me as if he could will the universe to undo what had been done. His voice cracked at the edges, boyish and petulant, and for the first time maybe in my whole damn life, I saw him not as the golden boy they had always propped up, but as what he really was, a man who had never learned how to lose because no one had ever made him. I smiled, slow and cruel and maybe a little sad, because I knew something he did not yet understand. It was absolutely over. The only thing left was to watch how badly he would break trying to deny it. The snow came down heavier than I had seen it in years, thick wet flakes that clung to the ground and to the trees and to the roof of the old cabin like they were trying to bury it all in silence. My boots crunched loudly in the fresh powder as I made my way up the narrow drive, the old ruts barely visible beneath the white blanket, and for a moment it felt like I was walking into another world altogether. One stripped clean of the noise and bitterness that had filled it only a week ago. The cabin stood there, dark and hunched against the heavy sky, its windows shuttered and its porch sagging under the weight of a snowdrift that had already half-covered the front steps. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, not even a lazy trail of animals cutting through the drifts, just emptiness stretching out in every direction, as if the place itself had given up on being wanted. I stopped about halfway up the drive, the cold seeping through my jeans and the wind picking at the loose strands of hair that had escaped my hat, and just stared at it for a long moment. It was not a grand place, never had been, nothing like the glossy vacation homes other families bragged about at barbecues and Christmas parties, but it had been ours, chipped paint and leaky roof and rattling pipes and all. And even with everything that had happened, even with the betrayal still stinging under my skin like nettles, some part of me had hoped it would still feel like home. It didn't. It just felt empty. I shifted the small wooden sign under my arm and kept walking, my breath coming out in short, sharp puffs that vanished almost as soon as they left my mouth. When I reached the old oak tree near the edge of the clearing, the one where Derek and I used to race to when we were little, laughing and shoving and pretending the mossy trunk was base in some endless, ruleless game, I set down the sign and pulled a hammer from my coat pocket. The first nail went in crooked, biting into the rough bark like a bad tooth, and it took me 2 tries to straighten it, my fingers stiff with cold and something that might have been reluctance. I hammered the second nail harder than necessary, the sharp crack of metal against wood splitting the stillness like a gunshot, and somewhere in the trees a startled crow flapped into the air, its wings cutting ragged holes through the falling snow. When the sign was finally secure, I stepped back and read it, the black letters stark against the pale wood. Private property, no trespassing, no frills. No explanation. Just a boundary drawn clear and deep and final. I tucked the hammer back into my pocket and stood there for a while, listening to the wind whistle through the bare branches, feeling the ache settle deeper in my chest with every passing second. There was no going back now, no mending fences or smoothing things over with a carefully worded apology or a half-hearted family dinner where we all pretended nothing had changed. Because everything had changed. I had changed. The girl who would have swallowed her hurt and smiled politely, who would have hugged her brother and congratulated him through gritted teeth, who would have driven home with tears burning behind her eyes and a lump in her throat so big she could barely breathe, that girl was gone. In her place was someone colder, harder, someone who understood now that playing nice only made you an easier target. But standing there in the heavy, muffled quiet, with the snow burying the world around me inch by inch, I wondered if maybe I had not just beaten them at their own game. Maybe I had become exactly like them in the process. I thought about my mother's tears, about the way my father's mouth had twisted into something bitter and ugly, about the way Derek's voice had cracked when he realized he could not bully or charm his way out of this mess. And for the first time since Christmas morning, the taste of victory soured on my tongue. I turned away from the cabin without looking back, trudging back down the drive with the snow clinging to my boots and the cold worming its way deep into my bones. When I reached my car, I slammed the door a little harder than necessary, the sound shockingly loud in the frozen stillness. For a long moment I just sat there, hands clenched on the steering wheel, staring at the windshield as the snow melted in lazy rivulets across the glass. I had won. I had gotten exactly what I wanted. And yet, sitting there with the engine idling and the heater blowing weakly against the creeping chill, I could not shake the feeling that maybe all I had really done was build a different kind of prison, one with walls made of stubbornness and barbed wire spun from pride. The cabin grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror as I backed carefully down the drive, the sign on the oak tree disappearing into the swirling white until it was just another dark smudge in a landscape already full of ghosts. Maybe some victories are not about winning at all. Maybe they are just quieter kinds of losses, the kind you carry alone, heavy and bitter and silent, long after the snow has covered everything you thought you could not live without.